Welcome to the Commander's Beacon. I am Eric, and we've got yet another Adventures in the Forgotten Realms Commander deck for you today. That's right, it's mono white and Commander, and it isn't even that new artifact pod fiddler guy, whatever he is. Instead, we're playing a medium-sized white legendary dragon that's sort of like an MDFC, but sort of not. Icingdeath, Frost Tyrant, is a 4/3 dragon with flying and vigilance. It costs 2 white, and when it dies you create Icingdeath Frost Tongue, a legendary white equipment artifact token that gives the equipped creature +2/+0, and whenever the equipped creature attacks, you tap target creature defending player controls. It has an equip cost of 2. That's right, the vast majority of Icingdeath's card text just tells you about the equipment that you get when it dies. So Icingdeath is pretty simple in principle. It's a nearly vanilla body that gives you an equipment token when it dies. So like MDFC commanders, it sort of has 2 modes, except you can recast Icingdeath from your command zone after it dies, then equip it with its own tongue. How awesome is that? Note that Icingdeath Frost Tongue is also legendary, so Icingdeath can only ever have 2 tongues at any time, one in its claws and the other, presumably, in its mouth. Okay, bad joke. Anyways, we're getting off subject. This is, again, a fairly simple commander in principle, but we're going to try to combine every single facet of what this card does to make what I think is a fairly interesting deck. And let's talk about how we're going to do that. So Icingdeath Frost Tyrant has Vigilance. That means you can pretty much attack with it every turn, and you don't need to worry about your opponent's counterattacking because Icingdeath will still be untapped and able to block. That's pretty cool. I actually think Vigilance is underrated in Commander because when you don't need to hold back blockers, that's basically kind of like free damage that you get to deal during your combat phase. I mean, how often do you decide not to attack because you need to keep some untapped creatures to block with? Probably quite a bit, right? And not only does Icingdeath Frost Tyrant pretty much never tap itself, its equipment, the Frost Tongue, also taps an opponent's creature whenever the equipped creature attacks. So we might as well go all in on tapping down all of the creatures, except of course for our own. Meekstone and Crackdown prevent creatures with power 3 or greater from untapping during their controller's untap steps. Technically Crackdown only applies to non-white creatures, so do be aware of that. And these are symmetrical effects, but our creatures have Vigilance, so they should hardly ever be tapping, so we really don't care. A Storage Matrix gives each player the awful decision of only being able to tap artifacts, creatures, or lands during their untap step. I don't know anyone who wants to skip untapping their lands, so this pretty much says creatures and artifacts don't untap. Bad for our opponents, but again, we're not going to be tapping our creatures or artifacts much, so we really don't care. Of course, preventing our opponent's creatures from ever untapping just means that they can't attack, but they'll always be able to block. Let's take that away from them too. Authority of the Consuls and Blind Obedience are cheap, just 1 and 2 mana enchantments that make your opponent's creatures enter the battlefield tapped. Awesome value here. But if they're already on the battlefield, we can still stop them. Of course, our Frost Tongue can tap down 1 creature per turn, but we can do more than that. Citadel Siege is a 4 mana enchantment. When it enters the battlefield, you pick Khans or Dragons. If you picked Khans, you get to put 2 +1/+1 counters on a creature you control at the beginning of your combat step. That's actually pretty useful. But we're playing this for the Dragon's effect, which says at the beginning of combat on each opponent's turn, you get to tap target creature that player controls. Again, combine this with something like Meekstone, and that creature might just never untap again for the rest of the game. Topplegeist is only a single white mana for a 1/1 flyer. When it enters the battlefield, you get to tap a creature an opponent controls. But it also has Delirium. At the beginning of each opponent's upkeep, you get to tap target creature that player controls if you have at least 4 card types among cards in your graveyard. So pretty similar to Citadel Siege, but it's conditional and it only costs a single mana. And finally, there's Yosei the Morningstar. This guy is super annoying. It's 6 mana for a 5/5 flying dragon, and when it dies, target player skips their next untap step. Ouch. And you get to tap 5 of their permanents. I've been on the receiving end of repeated Yosei death triggers before. You basically skip your next turn. As long as you can sacrifice and recur Yosei repeatedly, someone's going to have a bad time. And of course, we can do this in this deck, but we'll talk more about that later. So we have these very specific Staxy pieces that help keep all of the creatures tapped down so that our vigilant creatures like Icingdeath can get in for combat damage. But we mentioned sacrificing and recurring creatures like Yosei. Let's talk more about that next. So in order to create Icingdeath Frosttongue, our commander, Icingdeath Frost Tyrant, has to die. So we might as well make it easy to get it back. We can let our commander go to the graveyard when it dies, rather than the command zone, so we can recur it and dodge that commander tax. Brought Back and Revivify are both instants that let us return things from our graveyard to the battlefield if they were put there from the battlefield this turn. Brought Back returns any 2 permanents, that could include our commander of course, or Yosei, or fetch lands. The possibilities are endless. Revivify only recurs creatures, but it recurs all of them that went to the graveyard this turn, either to the battlefield directly or to our hand, depending on your luck with a dice roll. Angelic Renewal is a single-use 2-mana enchantment, and whenever a creature you control dies, you can sacrifice Angelic Renewal to return that card to the battlefield. Emeria Shepherd is the ultimate repeated recursion engine. It's a 7-mana 4/4 flyer, but it has landfall. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, you can return any permanent from your graveyard to your hand, or if that land was a plains, it goes to the battlefield instead. Nice. We have 26 plains in this deck, by the way. And because we have 26 plains, we might as well play Emeria the Sky Ruin. This land lets you return target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield at the beginning of each of your upkeeps, as long as you have 7 or more plains. So all of these things can let us get our commander back to the battlefield after it dies, so we don't need to be afraid to let it die and get that equipment out of it. But our deck has plenty of other ways to take advantage of recursion, and we've got some more recursion resources too. Sun Titan and Bishop of Rebirth are both repeatable recursion on bodies with Vigilance by the way, so these two don't care about our meek stones and our storage matrices and things like that. Sun Titan is a classic that's just asking to be abused, since it lets you recur any permanent with mana value 3 or less from your graveyard straight to the battlefield when Sun Titan enters the battlefield or attacks. Bishop of Rebirth is much less of a removal target, since it's only a 3/4 body instead of a 6/6, and it only recurs creature cards with mana value 3 or less, and only when it attacks, not when it enters the battlefield. But it's still good value. Now, neither Sun Titan nor Bishop of Rebirth can recur our commander, since its mana value is 4, but we'll still get plenty of value from them. Now, we've also got a Darkar Valkyrie. This is kind of a nifty recursion. It's a 6-mana 4/5 flyer, and you can tap it, and when target creature other than a Darkar Valkyrie dies this turn, you return that card to the battlefield under your control. So this can recur our commander immediately when it dies, but notice also that a Darkar Valkyrie isn't limited to targeting your own creatures, so you can just start stealing your opponent's creatures when they die too. Also, it has Vigilance, just saying. There's Cavalier of Dawn, also has Vigilance. When it enters the battlefield, you generous gift a thing. Then when Cavalier of Dawn dies, you get to return an artifact or enchantment from your graveyard to your hand. Again, this can't recur our commander, but it can recur Angelic Renewal, which can recur our commander. So we've got all this recursion, but that's only half of the story. It's great that we can recur our commander from the graveyard, so we can make that Icingdeath Frosttongue equipment, or just recur any value creature like Yosei. But first, that creature has to die. Our opponents might help us with this, but then again they might not. So we also need to be able to reliably kill our own creatures. Martyr's Cause and Fanatical Devotion are each 3-mana enchantments, and with Martyr's Cause you can sacrifice a creature, and the next time a sorcerer of your choice would deal damage to any target this turn, you prevent that damage. And Fanatical Devotion lets you sacrifice a creature to regenerate a target creature. So these are great free sacrifice outlets that give you some nice benefits. Witch's Oven is also a nice, simple sacrifice outlet. It's a 1-mana artifact. It can tap and you sacrifice a creature to make a food token, or 2 food tokens if that creature had 4 or more toughness. This is a nice budget free sacrifice outlet. It can only be used once per turn, but it requires minimal mana investment, even if the payoff isn't that great. Of course, we'll play Ashnod's Altar, which lets us sacrifice a creature to add 2 colorless mana. This basically pays for Icingdeath's commander tax if we're sacrificing it to make Frosttongue and then recasting it, so that's not bad. And then finally we'll play High Market, which is a sacrifice outlet on a land. But again, Icingdeath Frost Tyrant is not the only thing that will get value by sacrificing. Let's mention a few other examples. A Triplicate Titan is a 9-mana 9/9 artifact creature. It's a golem with flying, vigilance, and trample. Yep, more vigilance. And when it dies, you make a 3/3 golem token with flying, a 3/3 golem with trample, and a 3/3 golem with vigilance. So obviously Triplicate Titan likes to be sacrificed and recurred from the graveyard. There's Scuttling Doom Engine. This is a 6-mana 6/6 that deals 6 damage to target opponent or planeswalker when it dies. This can really help us finish off a weakened opponent if we can't get him for combat damage, especially if we can recur it repeatedly from the graveyard. But you know who else has Vigilance? Loyal Warhound. It's a 3/1 and it ramps you for a plains out of your deck onto the battlefield when it enters. As long as at least one opponent has more lands than you, you're playing mono white, somebody should. And so this is not bad for just 2 mana. And again, recurring it repeatedly gives you more ramp. We've got Cataclysmic Gearhulk. It's another artifact creature. It's a 4/6. Guess what? It's got Vigilance. And when it enters the battlefield, each player chooses an artifact, a creature, an enchantment, and a planeswalker from among the non-land permanents they control, and sacrifices the rest. It's not very useful to recur Cataclysmic Gearhulk in rapid succession, but being able to recur it at all will definitely keep your opponents on edge about rebuilding their boards after it resolves the first time. And when we're done sacrificing things and we want our threats to stick around and start smashing in for combat damage, we've got things like Alseid of Life's Bounty, Benevolent Bodyguard, Selfless Savior. These are all 1-mana creatures that can be sacrificed to give a target creature some form of protection or indestructible, and with our recursion we can reuse these repeatedly. So we play all these creatures that want to be recurred, and we can sacrifice them, then recur them instantly with our Angelic Renewals and our Brought-Backs. In playtesting this deck, I got to sacrifice my own Cavalier of Dawn to Ashnod's Altar, then immediately recur it with Angelic Renewal and sacrifice it again to blow up 2 permanents, recur 2 enchantments or artifacts from my graveyard to my hand, and generate 4 colorless mana. And that's actually most of what this deck does. We're going to tap down our opponent's creatures with Icingdeath Frosttongue and our other Staxy effects like Meekstone. We have lots of vigilant creatures that can dodge these Stax effects, and we'll use sacrifice and recursion effects to turn our commander into that Frosttongue equipment and take advantage of other on-death or enters the battlefield effects on our other creatures. But of course there's lots of other cards in the deck, and some of them also synergize with our deck strategy, so let's talk about those too. Halvar, God of Battle, is pretty good in this deck. First, it gives all of your equipped creatures double strike, which is great since our commander can die to create an equipment. But you could alternatively cast Halvar as the reverse side of the card as an MDFC, and that reverse side is Sword of the Realms. And this is just perfect. This is 1 and a white for an equipment that costs 1 and a white to equip, and the equipped creature gets +2/+0 and Vigilance. And when the equipped creature dies, you return it to its owner's hand. This does pretty much everything our deck wants. The Tome of Legends gets a page counter whenever our commander enters the battlefield or attacks, which should be happening all the time since it's got Vigilance, so the opportunity cost to attack is very low. And it's got flying, so you'll be able to find somebody that you can attack maybe without getting blocked and getting your commander killed. And you can trade in those page counters on the Tome of Legends for card draw. Priest of Ancient Lore and Thraben Inspector are mono-white creatures with enter the battlefield card draw effects, which is pretty hard to come by in mono-white. Technically, Thraben Inspector only makes a clue token, so you'll need to spend extra mana to get that card draw. I chose not to include Wall of Omens in this deck since while it does give you a card when it enters the battlefield, it also can't attack, and we get a lot of value from our attackers and our equipment and some other buffs like Halvar, so I just didn't think Wall of Omens was worth it here. Speaking of equipment and other support, we've got Mask of Memory, Rogue's Gloves, Zephyr Boots. All of these are equipment that help us with card draw, or at least card filtering, when the equipped creature deals combat damage to a player. And if we're tapping down our opponent's creatures, this should be really easy to achieve. Mirror Shield and Swiftfoot Boots help protect our creatures when we want them to stick around. We've got Loxodon Warhammer to help protect our life total and push in a bit more damage with Trample. And finally, since we're in mono white, we'll have an easy time paying the 3 white mana pips in the mana cost for True Conviction which gives all of our creatures double strike and lifelink. True conviction can end games. When it comes to ramp, we've got Solemn Simulacrum and Burnished Heart, which are pretty much commander staples at this point, so I won't say too much about them, but they do work really well in a deck like this one since we can recur and reuse them. Now for removal, I like Giant Killer. This is an adventure card that can kill a creature with power 4 or greater at instant speed for 2 and a white, and the creature half of the card lets you pay 1 and a white and tap it to tap target creature, so it's more redundancy in helping us tap down our opponent's sides of the board. We'll also use Realm-Cloaked Giant. It's got a 5-mana sorcery that destroys all non-giant creatures, and the creature side of the card is a 7/7 giant with Vigilance, and because we like Vigilance that much in this deck. And those are the most noteworthy cards in this deck. Like always, I haven't mentioned everything here, but you can check out the video description where you'll find a link to the full deck list. Now let's go over the deck stats and cost. Alright, deck stats. Our mono-white Icingdeath Frost Tyrant deck has an average mana value of 2.92. We have 36 lands, and we have 25 creatures, not counting the commander. And of those creatures, 8 have Vigilance. Now that's not a whole lot, but most of our big creatures have Vigilance, and that's what really matters because those are the ones that we want to attack with anyways. Our smaller utility creatures would probably just die if they attack, and they're not going to provide as much value for us anyway, so we don't need the Vigilance as much on them. Now, not counting Icingdeath Frosttongue, that equipment that our commander gives us when it dies, we have 9 stacks pieces that either tap down our opponent's creatures or prevent them from untapping. Some of these effects will apply to us as well, but with our Vigilance creatures we'll have a much easier time avoiding them. We have 10 cards that help us recur things from our graveyard. There's various types here. Some need to be used at the same turn that something dies, like Brought Back. Some can only recur specific permanent types, like Cavalier of Dawn. But generally these are going to help us recur our commander from the command zone when it dies so we can get that equipment without driving up our commander tax too much. And if our opponents won't kill Icingdeath for us, we have 5 sacrifice outlets. We're also running 10 mana ramp spells and 11 card draw spells. We also have 3 lands that help us draw cards like Bonder's Enclave. I'm not counting these as card draw because the rate of return is not very good, but you're in mono white, you might need the card draw help, so you'll use these if you really need to. And then finally we've got 7 pieces of single target removal and 4 board wipes. Of course I'm not counting all of the effects that let us tap down our opponent's creatures, which is also sort of like removal. At the time of this recording, this deck has a value of $161.16 on TCGplayer.com. There's a few cards over $5 that you might consider cutting to reduce the budget, but I generally wouldn't recommend it as these are all very useful for the deck. Ashnod's Altar is a really great sacrifice outlet that produces mana. You can use this to sacrifice your commander, and the mana you generate can help pay the commander tax to recast it. Emeria the Sky Ruin is also over $10. This is a late game payoff that gives us awesome free graveyard recursion once per turn, as long as we have 7 or more planes. And we're playing mono white, so this is easy. We also really value graveyard recursion with this deck, and we even have a few sacrifice outlets to help us get it. I wouldn't say this deck absolutely needs Emeria, but you will definitely get a lot of value from it. Esper Sentinel is a 1-mana creature that's $15. It's amazing card draw. There really isn't any replacement for this in mono white, but if you're on a budget you'll just have to accept some more underwhelming card draw options. And finally there's Crackdown, which is around $10. This is an amazing piece that keeps our opponent's creatures tapped down. This is another one that doesn't really have a replacement, and I would really encourage you to keep this one in the deck if you can possibly budget for it. And finally, of course, there's some higher budget white staples that I haven't included, just to keep the deck's price tag down a bit, but use them if you have them. Classic white staples like Teferi's Protection and Smothering Tithe, they kind of go in almost all decks that have white in them. So that is Icingdeath Frost Tyrant. I really like equipment, and I actually like the color white in Commander too, so I was interested in Icingdeath early on, but it took a while to come up with a reasonable deck for this one. Playing mono white is tough, and even among mono white commanders, Icingdeath isn't particularly strong. But we can utilize everything this commander does with this deck. We'll take advantage of our commander's Vigilance by attacking every turn, and the flying to give it evasion. With the Frost Tongue equipment, those attacks will tap down our opponent's creatures. And with our other hate pieces like Meekstone and Crackdown, we'll keep those creatures tapped down so we can keep on swinging in. Other than that, our graveyard recursion effects will multiply the value we get from white classics like Sun Titan and Cavalier of Dawn, but we can also use it to help turn our Frost Tyrant into the Frost Tongue much more readily too. So this is a pretty fair white beatdown deck, but it has a lot of synergy too, and it's been pretty fun in playtesting. But I think that's all I have for today. I've exhausted all of the unique Adventures in the Forgotten Realms commander decks that I've been able to come up with so far, but definitely let me know if there's any unique strategy or deck idea you'd like to see built around in the future, whether it's from Adventures in the Forgotten Realms or otherwise. I did get a request in the last day or two for a deck built around Nihilor. This is an Esper commander from the Adventures in the Forgotten Realms commander set. And Nihilor is a really interesting looking commander that steals your opponent's creatures, then rewards you for attacking with him. But there's a lot of hoops to jump through to get Nihilor to be effective. That said, the effect is pretty strong and also pretty unique, so I'll be working on a build for this one. And no promises yet, of course, but I'll see what I can come up with. But that's all I have for today. Thank you all for watching, and we'll see you next time.